I'm Phideaux Xavier, and you're listening to Sonic Perspectives.
The claws of a crayfish, it's true, pose little threat to a shoe. But we're lost in a blizzard of sound. In hard-armored words we are drowned.
Hello everyone, Nick here from SonicPerspectives.com, and today I'll be speaking with Phideaux Xavier, the namesake and leader of Phideaux. Welcome, sir.
Good afternoon.
For those unfamiliar, if you go into my dictionary here and look up the term art rock, Phideaux is the definition for me. Starting in 2003, they released 8 albums in 8 years, but since starting in 2011, left us dry, and until now, that is. Infernal is finally coming out soon, and since I know you've had a few issues with the vinyl, why don't you tell us what the release rollout's going to look like for Infernal?
Well, we moved up the date for the CD, so it's shipping already in the U.S. and abroad. And the vinyl, we're still unsure of when we're going to get it because we've had some issues with test pressings being, made at the wrong speed. So we're just waiting to get something that doesn't sound like we're on helium.
Have you found that one general sense I've gotten with music over the past little while is with the increase in the popularity of vinyl, the amount of manufacturers hasn't quite kept up with the recent surge. Have you found it more difficult to work with vinyl this time around?
Well, it's certainly the schedule is a lot further out. It's instead of being 5 weeks from when you make the order, it's definitely more like 9 or 10 weeks, and so things are definitely backed up. And it's good. I mean, I'm glad that people are pressing vinyl, and I'm glad that people want to consume vinyl because I like the fact that you get the larger artwork. Yes,
and your album is very visual, and actually I'm going to skip ahead a few questions as we talk about that visual aspect. Just a few days ago, you released a music video for We Only Have Eyes for You, which would be, I would consider it the lead single off the album. And
correct.
If anything describes the video, I'd say it's very trippy. I think that's a fair descriptor. But you have a very traditional background in a normal television background in typical visual media. So what made you go in that very cartoony direction with that video?
Well, the album, I think art rock, progressive rock, my work is sometimes accused of being very serious and heavy messages. And this particular song, though it does have a message or it's discussing some things, it also I wanted to bring out the quirkiness in it, and also I think that the irony and the humor is there in my music if people are open to that. Mm-hmm. I think often my lyrics contain a few little Easter eggs of hints that we're looking at this through an ironic lens. So, although my work in television, in a narrative television soap opera is very traditional, my interests in the visual film media run perhaps towards more the avant-garde.
All right. Well, talking about the lyrics and the story a little bit, for those who don't know, Infernal is the third part of a trilogy. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the story of Infernal and how it relates to the previous albums that tie into it?
Well, Infernal is, the third part of a trilogy, and how that came about was in 2006, I was writing music with my partner, Rich Hutchins, my drummer, and we were holed up in his Brooklyn studio in the basement in cold Brooklyn in the winter, writing very kind of downbeat music together, and it shook out that there were half the music was kind of shorter pieces and half the music was turning into this longer song cycle, and the longer song cycle was emerging out of some of the subject matter in the shorter songs. And the shorter songs, I would say that the first album, The Great Leap, is almost like short stories from the world of Doomsday Afternoon, and Doomsday Afternoon is kind of the bigger story. So it's these little vignettes in that talk about different aspects of the world or different aspects of culture in the Great Leap, and then it comes into being, as it were, in Doomsday Afternoon. And it's a dystopian worldview of speculative fiction. What would happen if we went on X road, or if Y genetic manipulation occurred, or if this particular chemical was unleashed, and so it sort of takes the idea of potential futures and works a bit of a story into it. I tend to think impressionistically. I'm not, for me there are concept albums like Tommy, and it's like Tommy gets blind because he sees his mother, with the man who says, you don't see me, you don't hear me. And then there's The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which is sort of the hero's journey, but it's definitely a story, but it's not exactly that linear. And then you get to something like Tales from Topographic Oceans, which is a thematic, interpretation of something. So I'm kind of somewhere in the middle of those, because whereas I believe I'm following a story in Infernal and Doomsday Afternoon and The Great Leap, I couldn't exactly tell you the story beats for the Broadway play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's nice to have that thematic approach that you can check things from different angles. You don't have to go solidly at it from just one angle. Looking towards the real world for a moment, and maybe some of the inspirations, is there a particular path towards Doomsday that you think we're treading more dangerously towards these days?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I certainly think it's up to all of us to examine that. I know that I have always been fascinated with authoritarianism and fascism, and looking back on the ways in which people have had to live under 1984 style civilization in the past has been fascinating to me. Looking at early Soviet Russia, looking at Nazi Germany, looking at the Kims of North Korea, and
or even worse, the upcoming fascist regime of the Kim Kardashian of the U.S.
Exactly. Presidential hopeful 2026.
Yes.
Kim Kardashian. It's true. So you never know where we're headed. It's ironic because I wrote Doomsday. I wrote Infernal pretty much in 2012, and my sister often tells me that it's not really, it's like sort of prophecy, because so much of what I was writing about sounds like I'm commenting on what's happening now. Mm-hmm. And it's not really about specifically what's happening now, because it was many years ago that I really mapped out the lyrics and the flow of it. And I really wanted Infernal to follow on from Doomsday Afternoon. I didn't want to just kind of make an album and grab a bunch of titles and say, oh, this will be the third part of the trilogy. I really wanted to have it conclude in a rational way.
Yeah, and that's something interesting, that it was mostly written back then, because all of your previous albums, as I mentioned in the open, usually a year or two at release at most, and this one, of course, took a bit longer. But did you find it challenging to kind of, all these years later, when you were going to finish things, keep reaching back and trying to keep all these ideas fresh?
Well, it's interesting, because the album in 2011, we put out Snowtorch, and Snowtorch was put out instead of an album that we had planned to put out called 7.5.
I remember that, yes.
Yeah, and 7.5 was then going to be the thing we would put out after Snowtorch, because Snowtorch became the thing I really wanted to concentrate on. And 7.5 is basically recorded, it's just not mixed, and there's some tweaks that need to be made to it. So after we performed at Roz Fest, and all the feedback I always was getting was, when is the third part of the trilogy coming out? And so I was like, okay, I really have to stop with this, not putting out the third part of the trilogy. So I, instead of taking my energy to finishing 7.5, I said, okay, let me see what the band. Now we as a band had been performing a lot of music from Doomsday Afternoon and The Great Leap over the couple of years leading up to that. So there were modifications and contributions made by the members of the band to arrangements for some of those songs that differed considerably from the album. So I wanted to utilize those developments on new music. And so I kind of took a lot of what we had been working with live and tried to bring that into writing some new songs. And I also went back to the demos for Great Leap and Doomsday Afternoon to reacquaint myself with what was I interested in, what kind of chord progressions, what kind of musical ideas was I dealing with at the time. And so that diverted me from finishing 7½, and we recorded the basic tracks for Infernal in 2012, but then got asked to perform in Canada in 2013. So instead of finishing up the mix, we kind of got into rehearsal mode, because we're a 10-piece band when we play live, and therefore, to get everyone together, we all don't live in the same part of the world. I live in California. Ariel, my violinist, lives in New York. Rich, my drummer, lives in New York. People live everywhere. So to rehearse for the concert was several months of getting together, and that kind of took away energy from the album. And while we were rehearsing for the show in Canada, we started playing a lot of music from Infernal, and the arrangements for those songs were changing. So then after the show in Canada, I brought the band back to Los Angeles, where we re-recorded certain sections of Infernal. And so that brings you into sort of 2014, at which point I had a work situation where I had a new supervisor at work that was shaking things up, and we had all kind of burnt out on each other in the band. My engineer Gabe was working on other music for television, and so there just was a bit of a people taking a break from each other for a while. And during that time, I was listening to the album and really kind of examining it and looking for any moment when I felt dissatisfied, or any time when I thought that it was an easy, like, low-hanging fruit of like, oh, well, here's the chorus for the song. And if I felt that there was something that disappointed me, or I had a strange feeling in my body when I would hear it, I would go back and examine it. And so I kind of rewrote many sections of the album and started rethinking it, and perhaps I went down the rabbit hole a bit too much, but I'm glad that I had the time to really work on it. Now, what I should say is that during those years, there were also various other albums begun, and so I now have several albums that are 80 to 90% finished. There are 3 albums by an offshoot project I have called Mogon that are pretty much ready to be mixed. There's overdubs to be done. And we have 7½, still waiting somewhere patiently, and we're finally mixing some live music that we did. We think it would be great to put out a live album in the end of the year, beginning of the next year, because we're going to be doing some more performing. We're going to perform at Roz Fest and hopefully some other festivals. And so we'd like to be able to have people have a live album, because when we play live, it's often very different from when we have the albums.
Of course. And now there's a lot of ground to cover here. I had about 9 notes just in that response of different things I want to ask about, but let's start here with some of those other projects. Do I understand correctly that you are going back and revisiting for re-release some older Phideaux material?
Well, that's true. Doomsday Afternoon has been out of print for a while, and I know that people are selling it for crazy amounts of money on the internet because there are no CDs, and I have not printed new CDs because I am dissatisfied with the sound quality of it, and I want to make I'd like to release it on vinyl, and I'd like to make a slightly enhanced, higher resolution version of it, because I think it's an album that I need to treat carefully.
What I'm hearing is sell my copy now, and then just
yes.
pick up the re-release later and profit.
That's a very good idea. Absolutely, I would highly recommend that. Unless you like first releases, unless you like first editions.
I will not part with mine. Don't worry.
Invariably, I remember when everyone was getting the Genesis remasters, and then years later, everyone there were internet memes where people were saying, oh, the Trick of the Tail first issue, the worst one that they put out immediately on compact disc, that's the best one. So.
And it's amazing now how some of these older bands, and it only, of course, happens with albums that have already made back their money 10 times over, but bands like Pink Floyd, and frankly, one of my favorites, Rush, and I think Jethro Tull and some others have put out these box sets now worth over $100, focusing on one album.
Sure.
And it's amazing, that I admit I bought one. I bought the Farewell to Kings one.
Sure.
I didn't like it. I hate myself for it, but I bought it.
Well, it's funny because I have all the Jethro Tull reissues of these new box sets, and I personally don't like to listen to the new mixes, but what they have on the DVD is a flat transfer of the original mix, and it's in 24-bit, really high-res audio, and it's amazing to hear just like the original master tape in its purest form, and I really like that. And so one of the goals I have with the re-release of Doomsday and The Great Leap is A, to have them finally available on vinyl, and B, do a 5.1 mix, and C, have both the original mixes available as flat transfers on the DVD, as well as the new remaster for Doomsday. Plus, I'm going to do a pretty thorough remix of The Great Leap, because I was never satisfied with the sounds, the drum sounds, or some of the squashed nature of that album.
Anyone that listens to our other Talking Perspectives podcast knows that I am on the warpath for how underutilized 5.1 is. So any of your albums get the 5.1 treatment, I will be thrilled. I think that is a great medium that is underutilized by artists and a great way to express, especially your music with so many different instrumentalists and things that can come at you from different angles. I think that would be really cool.
Well, that's good, because then I at least have one person that will want to have the project.
You have at least one buyer, I can guarantee you that.
Exactly.
And actually, I know plenty more. I can guarantee at least like 10 buyers. Just
that's good. That'll
be
worth it. That'll be worth it.
So the other thing is, you mentioned Phideaux Live is a 10-piece band. They are playing Roz Fest this coming year, which I'm very much looking forward to. And one thing I wanted to ask, because it is so difficult to do things with a 10-piece, have you ever considered stripping down to maybe like a 3 or 4 acoustic or semi-acoustic touring outfit for a smaller tour that's a little bit more budgetable?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, we have occasionally performed in fractal components as exactly what you say. I've done a trio with my singer Valerie and my violinist Ariel. I've also done a quartet, including Johnny. And Mogon is kind of my way of making music that does not have to involve 10 people. So a lot of the same people from my Phideaux albums are on those albums, just not necessarily all at the same time. And I mean, originally my name is Phideaux, and I didn't set out to have a band named after me. I set out to make albums, and I kind of gathered a band together around me. So it was never my intention to, call myself, to have a band that would be named after me. So it's definitely could be anything, really.
Yeah.
But because Infernal was this group of 10 people, I think it's really important that this group of 10 people go out and can complete the work. Basically, we came together as a band to perform Doomsday Afternoon, because that was when we first got the opportunity to perform live. So this takes us almost full circle.
And that is such the nice thing about a place like RoSfest, is it affords you the ability to bring a full band there. Coming from South America, doesn't matter. They'll find a way to get you there. Those festivals are great for getting these rare and harder to get performances out there.
Exactly. Plus, we would not command a large enough audience. There'd be more people on stage than in the audience in many respects if we were to go to do a tour. So it's great to have one place where people are coming to see, 7 or 8 different bands, and then they might hear us, or it would make more sense for them to say, well, we're happy to see Phideaux because we can also see these other bands.
Yeah, and is it true? We had this conversation at Roz Fest this past year, and I just found it hilarious, sad but hilarious, that you actually stopped attending the festival for a few years because you were tired of people asking you about Infernal.
Well, I will say that I was very busy with work, and when I thought about trying to get the time off to go to the festival, which I certainly love Roz Fest and have always wanted to support it, I did perhaps think, if I don't go, I will not have to field the question. I mean, it's hard to be, to have your procrastination hauled out in public and considered every time you might, log on to Facebook. The only messages are, "Hey, slacker, when are you going to, get your act together?"
Yes, all those people are there together, and they all want the same thing. But
Exactly.
and while we're talking about some of the more stripped down shows, I didn't know if you had ever toured it before, but we have some mutual friends in Mark and Reina Monforti, and I know you've done some shows with them before. And just a funny story that when I was a fan for many years, well, since before Snowtorch, but that now is quite a few years ago. But in any case. For the longest time, I would pronounce it Phideaux, and I saw how the EAUX, and I thought that had to be it. And when they first told me, they heard it, and they corrected me to Phideaux, I didn't believe it.
That's understandable.
I honestly thought they were screwing with me, and I think it wasn't. I don't think I fully believed them until years later. I met and was talking to Ariel, who you mentioned before, and we become friends over the years, and she confirmed that was the pronunciation. I was just like, damn, at least 5 years I was pronouncing it wrong, but there you go.
Well, you were actually pronouncing it right. We just we became wrong. To be perfectly honest, I'm sure it will come as a shock to many listeners, but this was not the name I was born with. It's a name I took when I was 13 as my musical nom de plume, and originally it was to be Phideaux Xavier, and to be a very I wanted a very pretentious, opulent sounding dog's name.
I'm glad you used the P word, because I was thinking it, but I didn't want to say it.
Of course. And then eventually, a little later on in my life, when sort of punk rock was coming around, and I was perhaps getting into my more minimalism phase, I was like, well, I'm going to now say Phideaux instead of Phideaux. And so that kind of became the way of being. And it's funny because when I introduce myself to people at work, often I'll say, oh, hi, my name is Phideaux. And they look at me like, oh, that's really pretty stupid. But then they see the name, and it looks quite elegant, I'll have to say. So, I think it works in the irony, the juxtaposition between the silliness of how it sounds, but the elegance with which it looks, which takes me back to the why did I have a zany cartoon for the video of this new song,
And if anybody has any further trouble pronouncing your name, Arjen Lucanson did you a favor and made it even easier and just shortened it to PX for you.
There you go. Exactly. I like that.
So let's see. Let's go back in here to the trilogy a little bit, and I have to say with Infernal, I had this past weekend. I had some big Phideaux fans over at the house, and of course had to play the new album for them, and they were very giddy as they would pick out a reference here and a reference there. Did you enjoy? Was that something that you felt you had to do, or did you really enjoy going back and revisiting those musical references and spreading them throughout?
Well, I mean, I'll have to admit that as a kid, when I would listen to albums, I always loved musical references. I loved on the White Album, in George's song, where he referenced all those other Beatles tracks. Savoy Truffle, mentions other Beatles songs. I loved, how Passion Play and Thick as a Brick would end with the same music that they began with. I always liked how Frank Zappa's albums would have callbacks to other little nuggets from earlier things. So to me, that's one of the pleasures of music, and I kind of feel that all of my music links together. I mean, obviously on this new album, it's linked to those two albums more specifically, but there are other callbacks as well to previous albums, and even Doomsday Afternoon had elements or little Easter eggs from 313, as well as Ghost Story. So I did enjoy putting those in. I didn't put any in specifically to say, oh, I got to get one in here. But if there was an opportunity to put one in, or it made sense for the story or for the what the song was emerging from, then I definitely would do it.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I will say, we mentioned that you were a regular attendee of Roz Fest. You seem to keep up with the prog rock world, as opposed to some musicians who frankly say they don't listen to prog.
Right.
But in your music, I don't really hear any outside influences creeping in, despite the fact that you do keep up with music. How do you, do you consciously try to keep things fresh, even though you do keep up with the prog world?
Well, I mean, I certainly keep up with the progressive rock world, and I want to know what's out there. I'll listen to things. I often am not as much of a consumer of music when I'm in the middle of making music, because then I worry that I am going to get dissuaded by my own path and try to adopt someone else's path. So I utilize, I sort of listen, but I don't listen as much as perhaps I would like to certain things. I don't immerse myself in them the way I would when I'm not making music. Like if I'm going through a period of not making music for a couple of years, then I'll be very absorbent and I'll be buying all kinds of records and listening to them and listening obsessively. And I also find that I like many different varieties of music. So perhaps I'm listening a little more to folk music or metal or different things these days that that aren't exactly what I do. Mm-hmm. And very often I'll listen to things that I know very well because they don't influence me as much in the here and now, but they're comforting and they allow me to take my mind off of my own stuff.
Yeah. Now, if I am correct in this, I believe you've had kind of a neat experience in that you grew up in the New York City area. I believe you're in LA now, and have you had time in Chicago as well?
I never had any time in Chicago, no.
Oh,
no.
Okay. But still, you've been at the two extremes, the two largest cities in America.
Right.
Do you have a preference, or is there anything that people from opposite sides of the country should know and understand about the two there? What has your experience been traveling between those two, extremes yet similar situations?
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. I grew up in the East Coast. New York City is this compressed, almost like carbon on the verge of diamond, and it's a great place to, it's a bunch of little villages all stacked on top of each other. And when I lived there, it was really very creative and very fertile place to be. Los Angeles is extremely spread out. It's like, that you don't really know where the city ends and where the suburbs begin. Mm-hmm. But the people in LA are great. There's a lot of creativity here. There's a lot of hustling here. There's of course this is where dreams are made, and there's LA gets a reputation for being a kind of plastic, superficial place, which mm-hmm. certainly that's possible. As much as New York City gets a reputation for being a cold place of steely-eyed people, mm-hmm. trying to get where they're going. But the truth is, if you stop someone on the street in New York City and ask them for directions or information, they're very warm, very happy to talk to you, very approachable. And you can find many people in Los Angeles that are extremely deep, philosophical, people that are extremely creative and not at all superficial. So, all of those funny tropes we hear about the cities are kind of true and sort of refutable at the same time. And I do like living in Los Angeles. I never really thought that I would adopt California as my my place, but I'm now a citizen of the Republic of California, and I will stand and defend it. I never intended to leave, the Gotham state of New York. I like the earth a little more there, but the desert has its advantages. So it's nice and warm out here. I've become a wimp, a weather wimp. I admit it.
Oh, well, you got it out there. From what I understand, much more temperate. Whereas right now we're going through a nice hot spell out here, and then come winter, everything will be covered in snow. So when it comes to weather, I will give you credit. I think you got the better end of the deal out there. And if my ears don't deceive me, when we first started the interview, I thought I heard a little bit of hiss on your end, but as it's gone on, I'm pretty sure it's the ocean in the background.
That's certainly possible. It's certainly possible, like a giant conch shell transmitting.
So, okay, remember this for Roz Fest, folks. If you pick Phideaux up and put him to your ear, you can hear the ocean.
There's a lot of space between my ears.
Not where I was going with that, but very well played. But please don't try that. I don't want to get an angry letter after Roz Fest. Phideaux punched me in the head because I tried to pick him up.
There you go.
But because you are such a prog guy and you have embraced that, because there are people out there like Steven Wilson who will completely shun the label. But you're involved in the community, as I mentioned, and I just want to kind of get a sense of where you see the state of prog by asking, If do you see a capital amount, a dollar amount, or any sort of expenditure that could be made that would ever turn Phideaux into a full-time gig, even with vast resources? Do you see the genre big enough to support or to put forward a major act at this point?
It's such a hard question for me to answer, in the sense that my least capable component is marketing and understanding audience research. And one of the deals I made with myself when I started making music was that I didn't have to try to make it, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. I needed to redefine success for myself as artistic success as opposed to money and sales commercial success. I'm very privileged to be able to work a job that gives me a good enough paycheck that I can invest in my music and not have to try to sell myself to a record label to get my work out there. And I just happen to be around during a time when I can find listeners directly. Would I think that the music industry could support creative, progressive, artistic rock music? I would think so, but I think that the larger companies basically control what it is we hear. And there's so much music out there and so many ways to get it that I wouldn't know how someone can make an impact that, for instance, Yes made in the 70s. There weren't 700 versions of Yes in the 70s. There was just, each band was sort of one entity. Now there's so many, and anyone can make an album. I'm the proof positive of that. And so I'm not sure, when I was a kid and I grew up listening to the Beatles and Yes and Jethro Tull and ELP and Genesis and all that stuff, it was my dream to be a musician and be in the rock music world. I don't know if I was growing up today and I looked at the music industry if it would be my dream to be part of the music industry, because it seems very much like a commodity. So, having my artistic goals, I'm not sure that they are in line with what's happening in the music industry, but that's unfortunately not for me to say. I wish it were possible for people to embrace. And there's a lot of really creative and interesting bands out there, not necessarily in the progressive rock genre, very adjacent to the progressive rock. I think because I really have embraced a kind of classic 70s, people very often call me retrogressive rock, and because I do enjoy that style of music, maybe I'm a little out of step with the times, but that's where I'm at.
But the nice thing is, Phideaux is Phideaux. It's not like you have gone around chasing various styles. For most of your career, I think it's fair to say that you have carved out your own sound and expanded on it, even if it may have been born of those early influences.
Well, thank you. I would like to believe so.
And I know this will probably be one of the worst received things I ever say as far as younger musicians are concerned. But would you think it's advisable, or do you think, given your experience, it's at least maybe something to take heed of, that it's worth taking time? I know younger folks especially tend to be ambitious, tend to want to get their ideas out there. But do you think it's important to take some time, build up your base, especially financially in your career, so that you can help support and better fund those endeavors? Or do you think if, you're dead set on going forward, you just blow out of the gate as best you can?
Well, I mean, I wish I could, if I could. You can never go back in time and change the trajectory of your life. I chose not to support my music. I mean, I was always doing it. I was always working on it, but I definitely had the traditionalist mentality of get a job, get work myself up to security. So, but the people who make it are the people who really have that singular vision. And so, I mean, I'm sure the parents of the world will hate me for saying this, but I think if someone has a burning desire to do something, and they believe in themselves enough to do it, it's worth taking the time to really go for it. Because if you take a couple years and realize it's not happening, you can then auto course correct. However, there's so many different ways. And luckily for me, I have figured out, I finally did figure out that I didn't need to take the traditional route. I didn't need to be young and pretty in order to get my music heard. I could be old and grizzled and, like pay for my own work. And it's okay,
Yeah. Well, thank you, first off, very much for everything here. And there is one question that I think every Phideaux fan would hate me if I at least don't try to get out of you here at the end. We waited 7 years for Infernal. About how long are we going to wait for the next one?
Well, it depends on what you mean by the next
The next original studio album.
Well, there are several original studio works waiting around, but I wouldn't say that they're necessarily, a fresh new idea. Now, I will say that the next thing I'm planning to do, as I mentioned, is the live album. After that, it's my goal to put out Mogon's third album, which the title, I believe, is going to be called I See People, Flesh and Blood and Bone. It'll be Mogon 3, I See People, Flesh and Blood and Bone. And I will be doing a recording session for some tracks from that soon in October. And I think that's going to be a good example of where I'm at recently. But I also, years ago in 2007, I wrote 2 pieces of music. One was this guitar-based song cycle that ultimately ended up as Infernal. And it ended up as the first song, Cast Out and Cold, all of side 3, and the final, or the second to last song called Eternal. And that, if you put that all together, that was kind of 25 minutes worth of music. At the same time, I wrote this 25-minute piano piece that kind of sounded to me like Son of Snowtorch. And actually, it was, even though it was sort of written before Snowtorch, by the time Snowtorch came out, this piece sounded very much like if I were to have worked on that right away, people would have said, oh, he's just literally redoing Snowtorch. So I put that track away for a while, and I realized that it really didn't relate to Infernal, because at once upon a time that was going to be half of Infernal. And so I'm now revisiting that piece for the future, for perhaps turning that into a Phideaux related project. And but that's a very complicated piece of music, and I don't really have it in me to undertake that at this time. So I'm going to let that simmer for a while. So people will pretty much have to listen to some of the archival works coming out, being 7.5, Mogon 3, hopefully Mogon 1 and 2 will follow shortly thereafter. But yeah, it hopefully it'll be not too many years. I think you're going to see a lot more albums coming out more quickly from me, if not quote unquote Phideaux, because during the years I had off working on Infernal, there were a lot of albums that were nearly finished. So now it's just a question of putting the icing on the cake.
Well, good. I'm sure many fans will be happy to see those rolling out. Like I say, it's been a long wait. I definitely think Infernal is worth it, though. I've been listening to it for a few weeks now. I have been loving
excellent.
it. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. It has lived up to the time off. I'm so happy that after... I wouldn't be speaking to you today if I didn't like it, because that would have been quite a letdown after all these years. But I have loved it. I've really enjoyed it, and we're
I'm so glad.
happy that you're back. And since you mentioned that you're shipping out CDs now, where's the best place? Where can people get you the most money if they buy it from there?
Well, unfortunately, none of the places really give me very much money. So I will say that as far as I'm concerned, the deck is clear. However, I do always love to support the small CD online shops. I know there's Symphonic in the U.S. and Wayside and Cuneiform and the Laser's Edge. Also in Europe, there's in the U.K. there's Carlisi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. There's Just for Kicks in Germany. There's Progress Records in Sweden. There's Musea and Cosmos in France. And I believe in Japan you can get our music through the Garden Shed. Okay. Those are the places I know of. And, of course, Amazon.com. And if you prefer a digital copy, perhaps Bandcamp. That probably will net me the most money. But I always advocate a physical copy. So I would say, get a copy from Amazon, and hopefully you will enjoy it, because I really do think one of the things I was really determined with this was to make a package that would feel nice in the hand, that would look nice, that would contain beautiful artwork, and so I feel that the it's good to support physical manifestation of music.
Yes, and I certainly agree. And I saw there, I think online there's an unboxing vid of the new CD as well, where you can kind of see what's all there. The vinyl will be along in a few months. And, well, let me ask you this. Do you like beer?
I do like beer. I liked it a little too much in my youth, so that I had to kind of stop drinking it for a while.
Okay, so let me rephrase then. So what you want to do is you want to go ahead and buy the CD from somewhere, and then because he doesn't get much money from that, you go buy him a soda when you see him at Roz Fest.
There you go.
You definitely want to come to Roz Fest.
Works for me.
When's the last time that Phideaux performed in the States?
Well, we performed last at Orion Studios in 2011, and then we were just up in Quebec in 2013. And then we've been doing smaller fractal performances of trios and quartets since then.
So this will be the first, RoSfest 2019 will be the first full band appearance in the U.S. in 8 years. You absolutely want to be there. You absolutely want to catch their set. It's going to be something special. So buy Infernal. Go see him at RoSfest. And if you prefer the vinyl, keep your eye out. It'll be out in a few months after the factory learns how to press it.
Exactly.
And Phideaux, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, and have a great afternoon.
Once again, this was Nick with SonicPerspectives.com, and that was my interview with Phideaux. The CD Infernal is out now, and you can look out for the vinyl coming in the next few months here. I want to remind everyone, please make sure you like us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, share around our stuff, and if possible, make sure you subscribe to our podcast, which will get you all the interview content, some review content, and our Talking Perspectives series. I hope everyone enjoys. Again, this was Phideaux, and Infernal is out now.
You better run, you better hide.